is saying that what's happened to Job is God's way of punishing or disciplining him to correct something. And we discussed a little bit about how is that different from what the others had said. We kind of got off topic a little bit. Last week I didn't stay as well on topic as I wanted to. So I didn't know if I got to drive home the point as much as I wanted to. But basically the main point I was trying to make is Elihu was saying that all the bad stuff that was happening to Job was because of something Job needed correcting on, and that God was punishing him. And the question that I ask is, what happens if we view everything bad that happens to us as God punishing us? And I wanted to really kind of drive home that if that's our view, it's really a distorted and incorrect view of God. Like, God's not up there like wanting to whip us or punish us every time we do wrong. Bad things happen because of the world we live in and the way God set up the world. And it's not always like a one-for-one where if you do good, you're going to get good, and if you do bad, you're going to get bad. And that's what this whole discussion that we've seen in Job is about. And I really wanted to drive home that point. I kind of got sidetracked a little bit with some of the comments that the discussions that we had. Not that they were bad discussions. I think they were good. But that was kind of the point that I really wanted to drive home, was that, if we do that, I think we'll develop a negative, or we can at least develop a very negative view of God, him being a taskmaster instead of a loving father. Yeah, and
think of some of the very strict Muslim countries where women and children especially live in absolute fear every single day. They're just under that constant oppression.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And even doing the right gets them, at the end of the day, gets them whipped and beaten and,
Yeah, so you're basically serving out of fear, and there's not a loving relationship there. We can have trouble accepting our situation, whatever bad comes our way. We have trouble using it for Him, which we're supposed to. When we talked about that scripture, all things work for good to those who love God, but it doesn't mean our good necessarily, and we can't use it for God's good if our attitude is wrong toward God. And we also will become, eventually, anytime we're viewing that way, we would become angry toward God. And ultimately, I think, and we started off with this answer, I think Charles said this right away, we could lose our faith if that's our view of God. So I wanted to just make sure that we drove that home, because, like I said, I felt like that point might have gotten lost a little bit as we were having some of the other discussions we were having last week. All right, so this week we're going to pick up with 37, and hopefully we're going to finish out Elihu's speech. And in chapter 37, Elihu, if you remember at the end of 36, he started using a thunderstorm as an example of God's power. And I'm going to go ahead and jump forward probably a couple lessons here, but it's interesting, why did Elihu start using this storm as an example of God's power? So kind of put that in your head and just think about that a little bit for future reference. Because there's a couple of different possibilities there, but it is kind of not necessarily important, but it's interesting anyway. But anyway, so he continues the use of the thunderstorm and other weather meteorological events to call out God's greatness and power. Excuse me. So actually this chapter, when you read through it, at least when I read through it, I think it's a lot about the providence of God. So we're going to talk at the end, once we go through it here, we're going to take a moment to have a little bit of a more lengthy discussion about God's providence and what that means. So if you guys back in the back, if one of you can read, we got two sections of Job 37. The first one's a longer one. We're going to read 1 through 18. And we'll talk about that briefly, and then we'll read the last part of the chapter.
Hang on one second.
Do you want me to fill in the silence for a second? How much time do you need? All right, well, I can go ahead and start describing what 1 through 18 is about, and then we can get to read it here. But in 1 through 18, Elihu elaborates on how God controls the weather. He continues to discuss the thunderstorm and expands to including snowstorms and other types of storms. And he weaves in how God's power in the weather indicates his power over the affairs of people. And he encourages Job to stop, to consider the works of God and to think about what he understands as far as the way the environment works. So now we're going to go ahead and do that. Read that.
At this my heart pounds and leaps from its place. Listen to the roar of his voice, to the rumbling that comes from his mouth. He unleashes his lightning beneath the whole heaven, and it sends it to the ends of the earth. After that comes the sound of his roar. He thunders his majestic voice. When his voice resounds, he holds nothing back. God's voice thunders in marvelous ways. He does great things beyond our understanding. He says to the snow, fall on the earth, and to the rain shower, be a mighty downpour. So everyone has may know his work. He stops all people from their labor. The animals take cover. They remain in their dens. The tempest comes out from its chamber, the cold to the driving winds. The breath of God produces ice, and the broad waters become frozen. He loads the clouds with moisture. He scatters the lightning through them. His direction they swirl round over the face of the whole earth and do whatever he commands them. He brings the clouds to punish people, or to the water his earth to show his love. Listen to this. Job stopped to consider God's wonders. Do you know how God controls the clouds? He makes the lightning flash. Do you know how the clouds hang poised? Those wonder of him who has perfect knowledge. Do you know who swelter in your clothes, and the land lies hushed beneath the south wind? Can you join him, spreading out the skies, hard as a mirror, and cast bronze?
Okay, so there's what I just kind of summarized. One thing that really stood out to me out of this part of Elihu's speech, we've been talking a little bit about how arrogant he sounds, and that some people, I think, you read some people, and like when Charles talks about it, like they think he's extremely arrogant and condescending and totally wrong in what he's saying. Other people think, well, maybe where he's coming from is defending God, and he thinks that he has a more accurate view of what's going on. So maybe it's not as much arrogance as it is just the way he's talking and he's in the wrong. Whatever the case may be, verse 13 kind of is interesting because he almost hedges a little bit. He says, whether, the version that DP just read is a little different, but mine says, whether for correction or for his world or for loving kindness, he causes it to happen. So I don't know if he's still back to the whole everything's God controlling, correcting, or whatever, or if he's actually hedging and saying, maybe it's this way or maybe it's that way. Whatever, he causes it to happen. So anyway, I thought that was interesting that maybe either you get more arrogance depending on the way you view it, or you get a hedge of, well, I'm not totally sure, depending on how you view what he's saying there. But he says to Job, stand and consider the wonders of God. Think about these wonders. All right, then, let's go ahead and do 19 through 24.
Tell us what we should do. Tell us what should we say to him. We cannot draw up our case because of our darkness. Should he be told that I want to speak? Would anyone ask to be swallowed up? Now no one can look at the sun, bright as it is in the skies, after the wind has swept them clean. Out of the north he comes in golden splendor. God comes in awesome majesty. The Almighty is beyond our reach and exalted in power, and in his justice, our great righteousness, he does not oppress. Therefore, people revere him, for he does not have regard for all the wise in heart.
Okay, so in this part, and it kind of piggybacks right off of what we ended with, in verse 18 there, Elihu sarcastically tells Job to teach the people who are there. And we talked about how there's definitely more than just Job and Elihu, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar here. Like, the context indicates that this was being done in public and that there was some kind of a crowd. How many? I don't know, but there was more than just these people here. So Elihu sarcastically tells Job to teach the people there how to speak to God. And he summarizes his entire speech by applying God's sovereignty to Job's life and calls out for him to submit in awe to him. So anyway, that's Elihu's speech. I wanted to read something from, I've been using this Holman Old Testament commentary as one of the basis for looking into the different scriptures and things here. I wanted to read something from it that the author talks about related to Job 37. Like I said, I don't usually like to read long sections, but I wanted to read this section because there's no reason for me to try to paraphrase it for you or anything. I'll just read what he has to say. He says, life application, a knowledge of God. A.W. Tozer once said, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. The most important thing about you is who you believe God is. Everything about you is determined by your understanding of who God is. What you think of God is the mainspring from which your entire being flows. Like the foundation of a house that supports the entire structure, your knowledge of God is what upholds your life and gives it direction, purpose, and strength. Deep, intimate, personal knowledge of God is the leading cause of which everything else in your life is the effect. Who you believe God is impacts every area of your life, your attitudes, priorities, choices, and even your destiny. The true knowledge of God is so vast and overreaching that is the only subject powerful enough to define and determine every aspect of the lives of God's people. All believers must acquire a high view of God like Elihu had. The scriptural view of God is weighty and lofty. God is greater and more majestic than we could ever imagine. God is omnipresent, meaning he is everywhere, yet invisible since he is spirit. God is personal. He is therefore father, friend, and shepherd, but not the impersonal pronoun it. Therefore, he can be intimately known, loved, and adored since he is a personal being. Further, God knows everything before it happens. Furthermore, God is eternal, meaning he is infinite, without beginning or end. He is also self-existent, meaning he is dependent on nothing. These are just some of God's attributes that demonstrate his greatness. There is no subject more life-changing than God, and there is no greater determinative factor in how you live your life than knowledge of who God really is. So what do you think? You agree with that summarization?
Oh, man. I can think of some of the people that did a big group therapy for, and they hear that what you think of God, like, defines who you are. And I've got somebody in that group that they despise him. No relationship. Their reasoning is, why would God allow people to do horrible things to others, especially children? And if I told him that, I think his reaction would be pretty poor and fall a couple of fingers.
Yep, I think that's probably true. A lot of people would not like that, at least. Is it true? Does our view of God impact us that greatly? I think I mean, I don't know if you had answered yes across the board to everything that he said there, but I think it certainly impacts us because if you have a view of God like what we were just talking about, like that he punishes everybody, that he's out there holding the stick and just waiting for you to make a mistake so that he can put you down. If that's your view, how's that going to impact how you live?
Well, you become an oppressor. You become an authoritarian, like we see it in legalistic churches, both conservative and liberal, where the end result is legalism. When you have one extreme, you have an extreme view of God. Stay on the right side, on the conservative side. Well, God is he's waiting for you to mess up, and don't you dare,
Yep.
no mixed swimming, no,
Yeah,
like,
all the rules. Yep.
That mentality, and it was, you're always looking over your shoulder waiting for God to strike you dead for doing just about anything. And then the other side of that, on the extreme left, well, God is he's just free for all, like all loving. It doesn't matter what you do. And if you don't believe this, then we're gonna pound you into believing that. And so, yeah, I think our view of God definitely affects every facet of our life, and especially as it relates to how we treat other people. And I think that's, at the end of the day, we really have to get our view of God right.
Yeah, I think your attitude toward God impacts your attitude toward life as a whole, and that's huge, and that's why it impacts it. And on the flip side, if you don't believe in God, or if you have a very negative view toward God, that's going to impact that way as well, how you do it. Now, so Ronnie, I know you guys weren't here for a lot of what we've gone through because the lessons go way, way back before you guys moved here. But we went through a very extensive study on pain and evil and suffering and why the world is the way it is and how that jives with God being good and holy and all-powerful. Like how do you put those together? So we're not going to revisit that here, but I think that's where what you were saying, that you're patient, having that view towards God. How does God allow all these bad things to happen? And so, in real quick summary, really just a real brief summary of that is because God gives people the choice. We have free will, and because of that causes the world we live in, because we have free choice of what we're going to choose to do. And sometimes that means we hurt ourselves. Sometimes that means we hurt other people. Sometimes that means we get hurt by other people, because each person gets to choose if they're going to do what's right or what's wrong. So, I mean, like I said, that's a very long discussion. We spent several weeks talking through that, but like that, I think that's kind of where what that person was saying kind of hits. Like, well, how does all this happen? It's because we're allowed free choice to choose whether we're going to serve God or not. Let's quickly turn, just to emphasize, and the emphasis, what he was emphasizing there is that our view of God needs to be how high and how much above us he is. And because we're the created and he's the creator. And so we need to realize that. We need to realize our place. We are the created, not the other way around. So if we go to Romans 11, in verse 33, it says, "Oh, the depths and the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became his counselor, or who has first given to him that it might be paid back to him again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen." And then 1 Timothy 6. Let's see. Let's start in 15, I guess. 16 is where I want to get to, but which he will bring about at the proper time, he who is the blessed and only sovereign, the King of kings and Lord of lords, who alone possesses immortality and dwells in approachable light, whom no man has seen or can see. To him be honor and eternal dominion. Amen. So the writers, of course, through inspiration, but also in their own way, try to proclaim this high view of God and how he stands so much above us. And that's kind of what, when we get to the next chapter, when God starts talking, that's when you really get like, okay, who are we compared to God? Like, to try to claim that we can, tell him what to do or tell him how things should be. He's the creator. He established it all. So that's really the emphasis that we get to. All right, but I had a few questions here just as we wrap up Elihu's speech, just to kind of go through it before we kind of get into talking about that providence of God and what we were talking about earlier. What do you think about Elihu's speech as a whole? What are you, just real quick summary, what do you think? Good, bad, arrogant?
I think he thinks God was telling him what to say.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit, right? Like he thought that he had it all right here again, just like the others who had talked, telling Job.
He said he was knowledgeable.
Yeah, he actually claimed that it came straight from God, right? And we talked about, do we do that? Like, do we get so hung up on what we think, the way we think things should be, some of what Jimmy was talking about earlier, some of the rules that we place on ourselves. I mean, and don't get me wrong, we shouldn't go around doing things that we think God doesn't want us to do, right? I mean, that's not the point. The point is that sometimes people set, like, if this is what God says, and they'll set the rules, just like the Pharisees, like here, like don't go past here, but what about all this space between here and what God says? What do we do with that? We argue it as if it came straight from God, right? That this space that we think, and I think both sides can be guilty of that, of whenever you get into some of those discussions of arguing as if it's what God said, but we don't see it. It's not there necessarily. What else? What else did you notice or think about as we went through Elihu's speech?
Sure convicted of what he believes in. Got to give him that credit.
Yep. I think he deserves credit for being convicted, and he deserves credit for defending God. Like he thinks that he's God's spokesperson here, saying you guys are speaking wrongly of God. So, and in that way, and he certainly has a high view of God. So those things he's got right. What are some of the things that he has wrong?
For me personally, this is a lesson that the more confident we are in our position about who God is, the more that maybe is a red flag that says we probably ought to dial it back a little bit and kind of enter into the mystery of God and say, you know, at the end of the day, even us Christians who have the Bible in its completed form, there's so much about God that we just don't understand.
Or if I could translate that to a little bit, the more sure we are of what we believe, the more careful we need to be about how we talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, I mean, like, I don't know, you got, those of you who have families, whenever you say something, I try to teach my children this, and I'm not a good example because I do it all the time, but to say, this is the way it is. Like an affirmative, instead of saying, like when you don't know, like I think this, or my opinion is that, when we speak in that, this is it, like you can't argue with me, end of story. When we speak that way, what does that do?
Shuts people down.
It shuts everything down, right? It just makes people angry. It shuts down the discussion. So whenever we're very sure of ourselves, we got to be careful about how we go about expressing that.
Well, you said about mistakes too. I think one huge glaring mistake that he's making is trying to give a reason for why a tragedy has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something a lot of times, when we sit with people who are in the clutches of despair and grief and tragedy, I think one of the biggest disservices we do as Christians is to try to give reasons for why that happened. Even if we think we have a pretty good idea for why it happened, it's not helpful to say things like, well, they dug their own grave.
Right. Yeah, timing is, we talked about that. Timing is very important. Like whenever somebody's just gone through a traumatic event or is going through a traumatic event, is not necessarily the right time to try to teach a truth or a doctrinal truth or whatever. The time for us to do that is when we're not in the midst of all that, to get that grounding that we need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see it here, where here in the case of losing everything, including all of his children, all of his finances, he lost everything. His home, lost everything.
Yep.
And here the response is, well, I'm going to give you a reason for why this happened. Clearly, it's God's discipline.
Yep.
Not the best.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, he's really saying almost the same thing that the others were saying. And it's ironic, he goes through this whole spiel about how wrong they are, but at the end of the day, he's almost saying the exact same thing that they were saying. God's punishing you for something you did. He doesn't say it that way, but that's really what you end up coming, the conclusion I reach after I read what he says is almost the same thing as whenever Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar were talking. I think we talked about being careful about how much you say when you're angry. He's really mad at what's been said. And so he's really laying it out there. And of course, as you just said, Jimmy, he thinks he knows it all, but he still doesn't have the full picture. He doesn't know what's going on here. So he's still coming from the perspective that Job did something wrong, and he has an incorrect view of how God punishes people. And we talked about that. Does God punish people? Yeah, he does. Does he discipline people? Yeah. Does he do it the way Elihu's talking about it? Not for the most part. He's got it. He makes some good points about how great God is, how God provides guidance to his people, how we should approach God, those things. But then he's got all these other things mixed in there that are just totally off base. That being said, who out of the 5 people who are talking here, if you remember, it's Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu, who do you think is most correct in this discussion? And that maybe that's a trick question, because we already talked about how everybody has things wrong, and of course they have some things correct. But if you had to pick somebody, and it's not a real important question because we know, but just kind of as I'm thinking through it, I have who I think might be more correct than others or have the closest view. Who do you think?
I think I'd pick Job.
Job? And why would you pick Job?
I would pick Job because Job is a righteous man. Job also, he knows he didn't do anything wrong. He knows he's followed God's word and he's done what God has told him to do. He doesn't understand why what's happening right now, but
Right.
That's why I think Job would be the one I would pick.
Okay. I think that's a good basis there. Anybody else?
I agree. I would say Job, and I think one of the most important things that Job did that runs counter to everything that we're taught as Christians is Job points the finger where the finger belongs, and that's at God. You, at a bare minimum, God, you allowed this to happen.
Mm-hmm. That's true. At the same time, now then, we've talked about how Job is he's off the rails a little bit on what he's accusing God of, right?
Sure.
And God's going to let him have it. and that's why it's a little bit of an unfair question, because if you go on into 38 through 41, when God starts talking, then we can see kind of how this all lays out. But God lets Job have it. But yeah, I could see that. Is there an argument for Elihu, excuse me. There's no argument for Eliphaz, I don't think. Is there an argument for Elihu being more correct than anybody else?
He talks more about the power of God and what God can do, how he can punish you.
Yep, the power of God, he emphasizes that. So yeah, I think it does come down between Elihu and Job. I think you can throw the other 3 out pretty much, in my opinion. Some arguments for Elihu: God doesn't rebuke him whenever God starts speaking, which, like I said, we haven't gotten there yet, but God doesn't rebuke Elihu. And he actually continues on the line of what Elihu was saying. So that you could, and I said about the whirlwind, like what might Elihu be using a thunderstorm? Well, God speaks out of a whirlwind, which is an interesting twist that we'll talk a little bit about here too. As far as Job, when God speaks, God says, to Eliphaz, he says, God spoke rightly of me and you didn't. Paraphrasing. So God says that Job spoke rightly. Now, then, does that mean everything Job said was right? Nope. We already covered that. Definitely some of the stuff was not right. But there was, God at least does say that Job spoke rightly of him. So who do you think was most wrong? You can't just pick one of the other three. I mean, no, you can't say the other three. You have to pick one of the other three if you remember. On that front, I would say Eliphaz, because God specifically calls out Eliphaz. He's the elder statesman of the three. And the big thing, and this is the big thing that we covered, he started accusing Job falsely of things just to try to prove his point. Remember, that was a big thing that we talked about. You get that in social media today too, right? There's a lot of throwing out there of things that slander of people. Well, that's what Eliphaz was doing here. He pretty much started accusing Job of all kinds of stuff, and he had no knowledge of that at all. So I think that just to accuse people of stuff that you don't know in order to try to prove your point or to be right, I think made him very wrong. All right, last question here about Elihu. So why do you think Job never says anything to Elihu throughout this discussion?
Do you think God was speaking through Elihu? That's my question.
Maybe. Had he given up on talking at this point? He defended himself, for all that time. Any other thoughts? I don't really know, but he doesn't. He doesn't ever say anything. Elihu kind of just keeps going. And then whenever he stops, nobody says anything except for God.
Well, he did tell him to listen to him.
Elihu said to listen. It could be that, did he think that Elihu was right? I doubt it. Yeah. I actually think, and this is where I'm jumping ahead again, to whenever we get to 38, which we're not going to talk about right now, but, I'll read 38:1 just so that we can see. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said. So God all of a sudden starts speaking out of the whirlwind. Now then, in this whirlwind, what made me think of it here is, was this whirlwind or storm approaching their position the entire time here? Like, is that why Elihu started using this storm as an example? Like, did he see it coming? Or is it just that God then just appears out of, like, nowhere, just boom, there's this whirlwind after Elihu speaks? But that may be the reason, getting back to my original question here, that might be the reason that nobody speaks, because maybe God, I don't know how much, you don't know the passage of time or what's happening here, maybe God just starts speaking right away, so nobody else has a chance to respond. That might be the case. It also might be that Job was just tired of the discussion and had nothing else to say. I don't know, but either way, it was just kind of an interesting point that nobody really responds to Elihu. The whole time you've seen this back and forth banter between Job and everybody, but whenever Elihu talks, there's no back and forth. Just Elihu has this long discussion and no response. So I don't really know exactly why that's the case. It may just be that God cuts off the conversation by boom, there he is. It may be that storm was approaching. It might be that Job was just tired of the discussion or had no good response or whatever. So I don't know, but it was just an interesting tidbit there. All right, so like I mentioned, we got about 5 minutes here, and then we'll carry this into next week. But wanted to discuss a little bit about the providence of God. So what does the word providence mean?
Does it mean something along the lines of preparation for?
Preparation for?
That was a question.
That's not the way I've heard it defined, but
I don't have my phone with me. I can't Google it.
yeah, well, what's the dictionary definition, I guess, of providence? I didn't even look that up.
Hey Siri.
Jimmy, you got your phone out? What's
I got mine turned off.
I'm sorry, I've just been browsing Facebook.
Look, Google providence? What's the definition?
The town in Rhode Island.
Town in Rhode Island, yeah.
Providence is the protective care of God or of nature as a spiritual power.
Okay, so yeah, the term providence is derived from Latin providentia. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it in Latin. Providentia. Providentia. That's Italian. Providentia. But it signifies foresight. And actually, I was curious about what the definition would be when you Googled it, because that's what the wisdom and the biblical, it's used to denote the biblical idea of the wisdom and power which God continually exercises. Oh, we got Siri talking now, I guess. Exercises in the preservation and government of the world for the ends which he proposes to accomplish. So in that way, if you maybe from preparation, you're talking about like foresight, like God having prepared things in a certain way. Might be what you were thinking there. So the question that comes to my mind when it comes to providence is, how do you think God works in the world today? You know, we read the scriptures and we see different things of how God operated in the world. How does he work in the world today? So you don't have to actually answer that if you don't want to, but just something to think about. Does he actually make specific things happen today? And we talked a little bit about that, like, you know, some people would say when a hurricane hits, that's pretty close, that just happened, right? Did God make that happen? Did he say it's going to hit right here? Or is there something else that causes that to happen? So on the extreme side of this question, there's something called deism. People called deists believe that there is a creator, but that the creator has never had anything to do with the world that he created. So never intervened in it. So basically the creator set up this world and then left it alone. Actually, I guess an extreme view would be an atheist who believes that the world just somehow came to be. That might be the more extreme view. But for those who believe in a creator, the extreme view would be deism. I guess whenever you think about it, maybe a deist would be harder to convince to follow God than an atheist, because in theory, at least, if you can prove to an atheist that there is a creator, then you would have a pretty good chance of convincing them that God is the creator. Whereas a deist already believes that the world was created, so you can't really prove to them that it was created, but you'd have to try to convince them that the God of the Bible is the creator. Either way, you have to convince them, but I would just say that might be a little harder to convince the deist that doesn't believe the world is really created for any purpose other than just somebody's fun, I guess, or something like that. On the other side, there are people who think that God controls everything, like what I was just talking about. Like, they see God working in everything. If you find a good parking space, God helped you to find that good parking space, right?
It's funny, every time I find a good parking place, I think my mom.
You think your mom,
Because every time we go with her somewhere, she always finds a good parking.
she finds a good parking spot. But if you run into somebody and become good friends, God was at work in that. If you had a bad baseball game, I use that example, how I used to blame God whenever I had a bad baseball game. God did that. God determined what was going to happen. So this would interpret everything as almost being a miracle. Or the defining a miracle would be as a being more powerful than us intervening in that event. Or it would at least say that God is providentially causing everything to happen. And that's where we go back to providence. And you're saying God is causing this to happen. All right, well, we're out of time. So that lays the groundwork for what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about God's providence and how he works in the world today. So thanks for the discussion and for being here. And we'll be back in